So before we get started on the conversation, just to quickly reiterate a thanks to all of our presenters, and if I could just quickly call them out by name, because we, as I said before, we pressed the record button. We really did get deep thinking and rich information, and we started that off with Jonah Rogoff from Department of City Planning, who was terrific. Jessica Katz and Shana Kong from Citizens Housing and Planning Council, and then Uriah Johnson, who's been great on several things from HPD, and then Christopher Walters from ANHD. And then last week, we sort of tried to sew some of it up with Richard Barak from the Borough President's Land Use Unit, and Richard was with us for all of the conversations. And so thank you to all of them. And thanks for the opportunity to shout them out, Joanne. I'll mute now.
Also, it was Tejamaji, right? From HPD. She was with us. No? No, okay. Just checking.
Uriah Johnson was our presenter from HPD.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
All right. Hello and welcome to Brooklyn Community Board 14's Lunch and Learn series. My name is Joanne Brown, Chair of Community Board 14, and I will be your host. Today is part 6 in our 6-part Lunch and Learn series, where we bring in experts to facilitate a discussion about urban planning, public space, housing development, land use, and the built environment. You can find parts 1 through 5 on CB14's YouTube channel. Previous presentations were from New York City Department of City Planning, Citizens Housing and Planning Council, New York City Housing Preservation and Development, and the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development. We also had a robust conversation in part 5 with the Brooklyn Borough President's Director of Land Use, Richard Barak. So I'm your host, but today's forum will be moderated by Gregory Alvarez, who is a CB14 board member and our resident expert in land use and zoning law. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Greg, and we'll just chime in here and there with some questions that I have as well.
Great, thank you, Joanne. So yes, I think the purpose here today is to try to process what we've heard over the last few weeks, and to see if there are takeaways that we can employ moving forward. With these sorts of issues that certainly will come our way and continue to do so. Just a quick anecdote. I did hear that my wife was telling me that she was listening to Brian Lair yesterday, and I guess during the call-in portion, someone actually did call in regarding Hortelia Road, the 1620 site, and had made some comments to that and sort of the all that came from the process during that. So, I mean, if anything, that's sort of microcosm, I think, of what we can talk about here today. With the presentations that we've heard, I think there have been a lot of, there's been a lot of good information that has been provided to us to really dig into and think about, and really thinking about, just in terms of housing, certainly there are all sorts of different projects that could come our way, but housing obviously has been the focus of this series of programs. And, thinking about the balancing that goes into those decisions, whether it's, looking at the clear benefits that can be derived from bringing more affordable housing to the district and to our communities. And then on the other side as well, to consider the impacts that those types of developments can have on the existing built environment. So I do see a few hands already to open up our conversation here. So let's start with Glenn Willen, please, by all means.
Hello, everyone. Yes, affordable housing, big problem for us. 1620 Cortellia Road is, as you say, is a good way to look at it. My personal opinion is for affordable housing is really important. There isn't nearly enough of it in the city in general, and certainly not enough of it in our district. But every time something like this is going to come up, we're going to run into this, not in my backyard. And there'll be a number of reasons for it. And the problem is there's no middle ground. We're either for it or we're for what the people around it want because they're against it. And what's happened in this particular case is that most of the reasons they're against it are just wrong. They don't have the correct information. There are a couple of valid concerns, but most of the concerns are just wrong. So what do we do about that? There is no middle ground on this. How do you have a middle ground? We build half a building? There is no middle ground. We either think affordable housing is a good idea and support it as best we can, or we side with the community and say we don't want this to happen. And I will always side with affordable housing. There's just too many people who are desperate. So anyway, that's my take on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Glenn,
Glenn.
can I just ask Glenn a question?
Sure.
Glenn, can you give an example when you say that people just are wrong about something? Is there a specific example that comes to mind that you
Sure.
think is a common misconception?
I'll give you two. First has to do with parking. They are proposing 44 parking spots more than necessary. We know statistically that housing, apartment buildings that are near train stations tend to attract people who are willing to pay a little bit more because it's easy transportation. So they don't have this many cars. And people who take affordable housing have significantly less cars. I mean, they're struggling financially. So the 44 spots are going to be significantly more than the 84 units are going to utilize. So instead of creating a parking problem, they will have some number of spots available for the community to rent, and actually, to a very small degree, minimize the parking problem. The other one is light and air. If you look at, I went over there and I looked at it. The houses behind them, one is a 6-story, one is a 7-story, and they are south, which means that this building, if it was 100 stories, wouldn't affect their light and air at all. The only people it's affecting are the stores across the street. They will be in shadow, certainly most of the year. And I can assure you that the store owners would not object to putting 84 more units right across the street from them where they can get more business, simply because they won't have to pay as high air conditioning bills in the summer. It's just silly. Now, there's another piece to this. If you look at the two buildings behind where this is proposed, they are very close to each other across the courtyard. There are no terraces, and all of the windows have shades, blinds, or something, because they don't want the people right across the courtyard looking in on them. They're not sticking their heads out and looking over this one-story structure and saying, "Oh, look at my view." Where is this problem? Okay, but they're making a very big deal about it because there's a few people, usually one person, who takes the lead, who screams, "This is a terrible idea," and comes up with a bunch of reasons, and a lot of people get behind it. Now, it is true that the platforms at the Cortelyou station are very narrow, and this would probably, certainly, in some, by the time it's built, will hopefully be back to normal and people will be going to the city, and it will add some additional people to that platform, and that is a concern. But most of their concerns are really not valid. Okay, does that answer the question?
Okay. Yeah, and I think, with any of these decisions, and what we found particularly with this one was that, it is very complex. I think that was the theme of these, of these presentations as well, that there are a lot of considerations that have to go into it. And, it gets very granular in terms of, how to balance the interests that we're trying to look at. But, and I appreciate Glenn's, comments there, because, it's very thoughtful consideration, and, factoring in, the values that he's bringing to it, in terms of his, decision making on the application. So
I might add, Greg, there's one other little piece to this. At our meeting, our public hearing about this, people were really concerned about a lot of this small, what I would call relatively small stuff. Some of it was correct, some of it's not correct. And they got caught up in these weeds, whereas the real thing that we could have done is that the affordable housing, the zoning that allows them to get those 2 extra stories says, I forget what it is, 25 to 30% of the housing has to be affordable. Well, they're at the bottom. 21 units is 25%. What we could have done is push them to add an extra unit or two or three, get up to the 30% of affordable housing. Now that to me would have been a really valuable exercise on our part, but that's not what happened. We came up with 112 different little things that you know not that they're invalid, but they were relatively minor. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and it is important, I think, to point out, and what we saw in the presentations is that, to truly understand what the options are under the affordable requirements, it's important to look at that so that, we can evaluate, how far we can push developers on that front to try to bring as many community benefits as possible. So. Yeah, that's definitely valid. Nicole, did you have anything else? I see your hand still up on this point. Otherwise, I'll take a few
No,
more hands.
put me to the back of the line. I have a completely different thought.
Okay. All right. Just going down the list. Why don't we go to Stephen Cohen then?
Thanks, Greg. I think I have a few scattershot points and one main point I wanted to raise. I guess one reaction to I thought what Glenn said was very helpful. I guess in terms of the we go in terms of there being no middle ground. I think we did try to for the Catellier Road do the middle ground option, which was yes, with a number of conditions that we wanted to see implemented, but obviously for a lot of community members it was the yes or no that mattered, not guys oh, we're saying yes, but we these are all the things we want to see happen along with this. And for a lot of property development we don't get that sort of say. So even if in an advisory role and moving along the process, and the fact that the developer's attorney seemed receptive to at least a good number of those things. I don't I can't say what's actually going to be implemented and whatnot, but it wasn't we didn't get a extreme negative reaction from what I could tell. I unfortunately missed the first two presentations, and I haven't gotten around to watching the videos on them. So apologies if I'm not entirely up to speed on maybe some things, but I think I did drop in the chat last week in response to Michael Cedillo's question. Part of me, in terms of like housing demand is kind of in a wait and see mode, because I feel like because of COVID, there's been a lot more receptiveness to remote work locally. And I think you can see this still in the subway patterns. Like I took my kids on the subway this morning, and it's still like, everyone's getting a seat, which obviously was not happening prior to COVID during, 8 a.m. rush hour. So to the extent that's long term and how that impacts local housing demand, is definitely something to monitor, and is there going to be more demand for housing and apartments with outdoor space, because people remember COVID and how just how valuable having private outdoor space was during those times. There's all sorts of variables. So I am curious what the housing market is going to be, and the rental market obviously is going to be over the next 1 to 3 years, and the extent to which offices relocate away from Manhattan, and big employers don't have as much office space, or if other secondary areas in locally become have more office development, or have more jobs, like I don't know, the Navy Yard or Sunset Park or what have you. So I guess that's all leading up to the main point, and this was also something that this was related to my question to Richard Barak last week, which is looking at the zoning map, and I don't have it in front of me right now, but I was looking at the zoning map last week, and Coney Island Avenue is just clusters of nonsensical different zones. And to me, and this is probably, part of my, having lived in Victorian Flatbush for the last 10 years perspective, but it seems like there is a very visceral reaction when you talk about, demolishing a single family or 2-family Victorian home in Flatbush or East Flatbush and start building, 4, 5, 6, 7-story buildings for, housing, affordable housing, what have you, especially in blocks that, where it's out of character. I think, community members really, they have a visceral reaction. And, we have a lot of local residents associations that, whenever something like that, is proposed or discussed, certainly there's some up in arms reaction. So I think, to me at least, Coney Island Avenue seems like a more, maybe a less controversial area of our district where, we could maybe explore, zoning changes potentially, or encourage, development. I don't know. I'm just talking off the cuff. I don't know how many stories, is reasonable. And, I know there have been some, condo developments. There's the one across from the elementary school, and there's the one, I guess, on close to Avenue C, on our side of the on our side of Coney Island Avenue. But especially seeing, what happened in like Park Slope Kiwanis on 4th Avenue, and I'm not saying Coney Island Avenue should have that scale or, or anything like that, but that does seem like a corridor where, especially, there's a bus route there too, there's subways close by. To me, at least, it's a sensible place to say, why not have some affordable housing projects on this stretch. And maybe, sure, there's going to be negative community reaction locally, as Glenn mentioned. That would not be surprising in the least. But, I think perhaps not to the same degree as, 1 and 2 family homes on, quiet leafy blocks, let's say. At least that's from my perspective. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Yeah, and I think your whole point about, looking towards the future, it's tough. I think it's tough for everybody. And that's sort of the mystery in all of this. And so, I think, help aided by the presentation from city planning discussing, what goes into actually zoning the city. It's it's a tough proposition. In some ways you're trying to preserve, in some ways you're trying to direct new development. So it is something that, is always out there. And I know, we've talked about how our district, we're subject to rezonings about a decade ago, that tried to address that. And I guess the question may be, do those, does the current zoning still serve the interest of the district? Are there any considerations that, we may want to look at in the future, towards, thinking about those things in terms of where to direct development. And I think, again, the Cortellu example is a perfect example, because that property was the subject, I believe, of the 2009 rezoning. There was contemplation for the MIH, to be used in that area. So, but it highlights for the fact the future and the things to think about. All right, so let me just let's hear some more input here. Michael Cedillo, please, by all means.
Yeah, thank you. And first, I really have to thank Sean and the chair for creating this space. I have not seen a lot of community boards who have tried to uplift the conversation and take a second to actually interrogate some of the things that we grapple with as a board. So I just want to really express my gratitude for creating this space. I found myself agreeing with almost everything Glenn said earlier. I mean, I think that we're in a housing crisis. And so part of what I was looking to figure out, and I haven't watched all the videos, but it's what are the inputs into that? Why are we where we are? And I mean, I feel like I left the sessions I went to and the videos I've watched with more questions than answers, to be honest with you. How do you determine what the housing needs of an individual community is, for example? And how do you invite further community input in a way that emphasizes collectivism and social responsibility rather than individual, individualism and maybe change aversion or nostalgia? And to your point earlier, Greg, who gets to decide and determine the design characteristics of a neighborhood? We at this point, would people in the 70s have disagreed? I mean, look at my building. I live at 570 Westminster, right? There is no doubt in my mind that the Victorian homes that predated my building would have been look at this monstrosity that is being built next to our homes. I'm sure the argument would have been this is going to alter the character of the neighborhood. I would argue that building is a net benefit to that part of the neighborhood, maybe obviously selfishly. So it's, I guess it's like, at what point do you get to decide those characteristics, and at one point are you crossing a line into it being exclusionary to some groups? And that's a hard question, I think, that I have in my head. And just a couple of other things, scattershot as well, I apologize, is, I just, to Glenn's point earlier about like, I think he was trying to say there's a lot of different ways we could have skinned the cat with respect to the deal we came out with the developer for 1620. And I too think that there were some bad faith arguments being made by the other side, by the activists from 1620. But I think like what I learned from CHPC's presentation is that there's a menu of options, and it kind of is rooted down to like, what do you want to build as a community? Did you want fewer apartments that were affordable at a lower AMI rate, or did you want more at a little bit higher AMI rate, right? Like those are options that we should consider as a neighborhood. And the community benefits, I know Greg and others were really key on, I thought were really smart and great. But there's also like, could we have invited the activists into that process a little bit more? And I wasn't a part of it. Maybe we did. But like, they were complaining about the grocery store. Like, could we have moved the farmer's market closer down that end to like make sure there were food options for people? So I just think, again, more questions than answers for me, but a couple of things that stood out to me from CHPC's presentation that were specific to our community, where I couldn't believe that like only 1 in 5 of the rent of units in our neighborhood are unregulated. Like we had a way higher percentage of rent stabilized units than most, than like I think double the citywide average. Yet like we have still over half of the people who are rent burdened in our neighborhood. So like, why is that? Like, what is that mismatch there? And I was also struck by, and I'll admit that I've for a while thought that like ADUs and basement units are a really good way to add supply while fitting into the characteristic of the neighborhood and also having benefits for longtime residents and homeowners. So I guess like, what is the community board's role if we agree in that, like to push that forward? So more questions than answers, but I just again appreciate the space to discuss this.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Yeah, and I think it's a grappling that the whole idea of zoning it deals with on a daily basis, trying to figure out how to balance all these concerns. It's all about balance. I think that's the theme here. And trying to figure it out. You work. So we work under the basic premise of under the law is that property owners should be able to do what they want with their property. So zoning came in and tried to regulate that to some extent, but there's still a lot of wiggle room. And again, the values that are placed on what we want in the district, and tempered by what the development brings. I think that's an important aspect of any application. Sean, I saw you sort of nodding your head when Michael was going through his presentation. Maybe we'll turn to you now just to weigh in.
Well, I just appreciated his Michael's frame around the those opposed to the 1620 Cordelia Road development, and wanted to push back most respectfully, not on what Glenn said, but a little bit on how you said it, Glenn, because I think to the extent to which we say somebody in the community is wrong about something, I feel a little bit like then we didn't communicate and sort of tease out their understanding and provide information and context. And I think this exercise is going to lead us to a place where we can better do that. And then I also, I think I'm probably nodded most vigorously at more questions than answers that all of this brings up. And so it isn't necessarily our job to always have the answer to everything. And that maybe the way to prepare for upcoming applications is to get together what our values are in terms of affordable housing, balancing that, because I like that too, Gregory, the balancing act, balancing that with our wanting to maintain the character of our community. And then, just sort of making sure that we have good questions in place. We have our values listed, and then we have good questions in place, and maybe adding extra requirements to developers like traffic studies, or I heard recently a conversation about racial impact, or in our district, you could have it even be socioeconomic impact studies, because one of the things that really sort of took my breath away was the extent to which we're socioeconomically stratified in our community. There's almost the same percentage in every income band in our district. That's unheard of in the city of New York. So just, I think it's good to have more questions and answers, and I think it's good to use them as tools rather than having like a blueprint, because, as we've seen from this top-down, planning in the city recently, having a blueprint just is, it's not, one size doesn't even fit all within 2.9 square miles. So that's what I wanted to toss in. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, thank you, Sean. Yeah, and I think it's where the community board fits into that process, and what kind of effectuated change that they can do, that we can all do, as part of the process, because we are just one piece of that. But certainly it's an important piece, and hopefully we can take that moving forward. But I'll turn to Joanne now. I think this might be an appropriate time. So please, by all means.
So piggybacking on Sean's comments and Michael's comments, how do we create the value system? How do we engage with the community so that we can build those lists, so we have this toolbox so that we can apply it? And I had talked earlier in this series about, when we can meet again in person, creating a conference of sorts where we have the entire district laid out, and we can actually, take all of the tools that are available to us in city planning, like Fresh and MIH, and plug them into sectors of the district like Coney Island Avenue, and really identify these parcels that, okay, we have this parcel, and it could probably accommodate, X zoning upgrade, for lack of a better word, but we're prepared in that sense. But more importantly, and this is something that I learned from the census, is when you involve the community, right? There's a process of behavior change that happens, and because they've contributed their values and their vision to the process, we know we've added all of those things to our list, values and our objectives. Then I think when a project comes up, in the backyard of someone who's participated in one of our conferences of such, hopefully in the future, they'll be like, oh, I remember we talked about this parcel, and we can do a lot with this parcel, and actually I'm okay with it because it's not going to impact me as much because I've already seen it. I've had a vision of it. So that's one way, I think, a really important way that the community board can be proactive and then active in the processes in the future. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Joanne. And I think, Nicole, you had sort of relatedly about this topic as well.
Yeah, I think I agree with, first of all, I'm always struck how smart and thoughtful and knowledgeable on these things the more experienced community board members are. And I kind of like Michael did, I have sort of a laundry list of things that struck me, but the main theme is around communications. And Joanne, you were just speaking about communications. Sean, you were speaking about what boils down to communications in many ways. And I think my number one takeaway from these is how incredibly bad, and I know I'm being recorded, so the city is at communicating. It's wild. I think I've asked the same question at every meeting we've ever had with a city official. I say, what is your communications plan? And I have never gotten an answer that I thought was satisfactory whatsoever. So that to me is wild. I know we're supposed to fill a gap. I think that's another thing in terms of communications. And I think the question is how we do that. And, in most of my takeaways were really about what we can do inside of the board and in interactions with the community, not so much about, I didn't walk away with like, oh, now that I understand how to use Zola, I feel so empowered to change all the zoning regulations, right? It was really much more, how can we set up, and again, I'm a director of communications in my job. I am Sean better yet, I work for Sean in my job. I have literally a parallel job. So I often am taking things I do there here. And I serve a community of members. And we just went through this whole thing where they were like, you're not listening to us, we're not being heard. And there were a bunch of tactics that we used to, one, make it clear to them, like, we didn't, like you said, Sean, we didn't know all the answers, and we were interested in their input in the process, and they weren't perceiving that because of how we had set the process up. So I thought a lot about how we set up our public hearings when we review a zoning change. I really feel like making the presentation that the people, you know, my experience with these has been, you go in person, someone gives a old school like flipboard presentation, right? The board is literally almost on a stage in front of the community. There's no private space for us to deliberate. The community gets super angry and says a lot of different things. We listen to that, but it's almost impossible for us to process it because we're still in like a very public, literally, they're all sort of to the side and we're there. And I think we don't have a chance to process that information in a way where we're free to really maybe be a little vulnerable about our own understanding. And then we have to take a vote on it and make a recommendation to the whole board. And I feel that there are just some really easy fixes for that. One is there's in the year of our Lord 2021, it has to be possible that they could share those presentations and materials in advance. I know Glenn had expressed a concern about like public information and when stuff is shared and when people know what, but I think the information needs to be shared with the whole community earlier and us as a part of that so people can absorb it. I think if there was any way to build in a process where the board could hear feedback and then there could be a gap where we could really talk about it sort of in like executive session or something before committing to an actual decision would be really helpful. I just think that we do hear people. We absolutely take the community's feedback into account. But I think it's a matter of us setting up processes where that's apparent to the community. Right now, I think maybe that isn't always so obvious to them just because of the situation and that scenario that we've created. And I really do want to say how much I agreed with Sean. Glenn, I learned a lot just listening to you now about the things that you think are like misperceptions around affordable housing. But I also agree with Sean, like, we can't just be like, you guys are wrong. Those are wrong assumptions, right? Like if people have that misunderstanding, that's a sign there's something that we can do better as a community board to help them get a grasp on what's a very complex topic. And I would love to see just one last thing. I know I've gone on very long, but one thing I've learned at my job more than anything else is if you communicate something once, it never happened. So I would say like with this Lunch and Learn series, I know that this is a drain on the staff's resources and everything. And I think like, is there a way that community board members could help with stuff like this more? Because this should happen every year. This should be like a standing service that we offer to the community so that they can understand how the city works. And so I think anything that we talk about that has to do with education, that has to do with communications, doing it one time is really awesome. It makes all of us feel good, but like in 2 years, the effect will have gone away. So we have to think about institutionalizing some of these things that are educational and communication initiatives. Thank you. Sorry I spoke so much.
No, that's great, Nicole. And I see Brian Lynn's question as well. I'm just going to read it because it's along the same lines. These past Lunch and Learns have moved me to ask the question: what are the current limitations that can keep the community at large from reviewing and discussing potential zoning plans at their initial stages? How do we keep the community looped in? So I know, Sean, you could definitely speak to this. I know that during Richard's discussion, he had mentioned that, you know, maybe there is a way to maybe get onto the community board's radar potential applications that come through once they get, once they are initially filed. I thought that was one possible solution as well. But Sean, if you could just talk a little bit also about, you know, some of the limitations we're dealing with as well as a community board, and see if there might be ways to maybe work within that to create more of that community engagement.
Sure. It also goes to Nikki's thoughts there too. I mean, yeah, that's our constant struggle. Our constant struggle is how do we get the word out? How do we get it sooner? How do we engage more people? Dwayne Joseph is has a mantra, and sometimes lectures his fellow board members on like, when you get it as a board member, what are your networks? How are you getting it out to your networks? I always think when I see CB6 do this, I think we could be using our link bulletin boards out in the public more. And Glenn Bristow, who's a community member who's been with us on all, or at least most of these lunch and learns, also wondered why there weren't flyers in buildings and in the public. And so, we'll work with the public to try to get the word out, and we'll try to get, an earlier warning system going as well. But Nikki, to your point about executive session, the open meetings law in the city charter has a very narrow definition of when we can go into executive session. And it's mostly on personnel matters. And I hope we never have to do it. If we're involved in a lawsuit, that's another time we can do it. Hopefully we never have to. So I think maybe, to your point, trying to better equip board members with knowledge will make people feel a little less vulnerable speaking in a public forum about ideas, thoughts, and questions. But and then I think, Borough Hall, when they hold their land use public hearings, they don't even comment on the input. They accept the input, they accept the testimony, then they go off and they ponder it. And then they go back into I guess back into the public arena, I think is their process, to bring back the recommendations. So I don't know if we have to be that regimented, but the idea of having a public hearing to explore ideas, ask questions, get community input, but not come to a resolution then and there might be something that we can work in when we have enough time. But these Euler clocks, they tick so fast. And so let's think as a board about the timing between, getting a heads up, putting it on the calendar for hearing, having the time to opine, coming back with a resolution, then taking it to the board. And if we can fit all of that in, then that's probably a better process, but that's also an if. I hope that helped.
Yeah, Nicole, go ahead. I know you put a comment in the chat here.
No, I think that again, I think to be super specific, like I'm really talking about how to set up a situation where people feel a different way, even if substantively what happens doesn't change that much. So I think, Sean, what you just suggested would be awesome. Like if there could be, we have heard you, we are going to consider this information. And then if there's the time, it can be the next week, it could be 3 days later, come to a decision. Because I just think that if you think of it like an act of theater or performance, having us sit there, 20 people who showed up because they have passionate feelings about this say they hate it, and then a very informed group of board members who realize that maybe they're working off of a lot of wrong assumptions, as Glenn was saying, vote against them. Like just the look of that makes it look like, and we don't care about anything that you say. So I think, Sean, what you just said, where you create that gap so that it's like, we heard you, we are going to think about this, we're going to consider it if the situation allows for it. I think that would be really, really awesome. And I think what you said about Dwayne Joseph, I think that's awesome. But I always remember, like, in one of my first meetings when I first became a board member, I said it at some sort of a committee meeting, well, what can we do about this or that? And someone said, well, you can do that as an individual if you want. And then my response to that was like, but then why did I join the community board, right? So I think we need to come up with systematic sort of ways that we're expected to consistently do things, right? So for instance, those reports that you shared at the meeting with Richard Barrick that the fellows had done, those were so cool. And I didn't even know about them. And I would have, I'm sure that's on me too as an individual, but I'm fairly engaged, right? I think, for instance, if the expectation was, we're going to give you this, and here's how you share it with your networks, right? So that it's not just up to people being enthusiastic or being like Dwayne, some sort of systematized expectation about how we help get this stuff out to the community. And again, that it's not all on staff. I think this is so important. This is my challenge with my own board that I serve. I have to work with our board development committee where they're supposed to engage with community members and they never do anything. And so I think the brunt and the obligation and the burden of trying to do some of these communications should not fall just onto the staff of the board. This is something that board members could help with too, in a really organized way.
Yeah, and Nicole, Stephen Cohen made a point as well that maybe there's a way to do that through social media, perhaps, to get that out to electeds who can help to disseminate as well, just sort of thoughtful ways to just get the word out. And we have that, there's always that period of time between the public hearing and the full board meeting. And, there's that valuable time in between those two that can be utilized as well. Glenn, I know you've been waiting a while, so and everyone's excited that you're outside. So please, please.
Thank you. I'd like to address 2 points. One, because I'm talking to you, not you, Greg, but the group of you, I'm being very blunt about how I perceive things. I don't think that the people who are opposed to 1620 are in any way doing anything malicious or intentionally doing something, saying things that are incorrect. They're just uninformed. So to address that issue, along with the ones that you've just been talking about, I have a suggestion that maybe what we need is a second public hearing to allow, because the people, the person who was leading the charge against 1620 was not in our public hearing, did not hear the developers what they had to say. So that might be a solution to getting information out. The second one has to do with what kind of input we could have in terms of the zoning in general. And that's a much more difficult situation. 10, 12 years ago, I found out that a building behind my house was, there's 2 stories being knocked down and a 6th story was being put up. So I went to Richard Barak and try to figure out how I could change the zoning, because it turns out half of my block, everything on the west side of Stratford Road, was an R6 zoning. So I was very concerned. And you can't just do that. It's very, very expensive unless you get the community board behind it. And Alvin said if you do everything with the northern 2/3 of the community board rezoning, they'll get behind it, and therefore no monetary expense. It took 4.5 years to accomplish that, to get changes. So if we want to change anything, because we think it'd be better if developers built here as opposed to there, that's a very big deal and very time consuming. So what we're left with is the individual situations that come to us. And developers want to make money. So they're only going to consider affordable housing if they can, in fact, add the extra 2 floors above the existing zoning, just as at 1620. And so we don't have a lot of say in this. We either agree it's a good idea for the affordable housing, or we don't. Like, I'm going to mute because that noise, but that's my points. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn. And I think, yeah, I think that does also point to the fact of, where whatever decision we do come to on a particular application, what happens to it, and what is the most effective way? Because and I see Richard Barrick is on the line, and it sort of may dovetail here. So we make a decision and it goes to the borough president's office. Now, when you receive decisions from community boards, and particularly applications controversial such as 1620 Cortellia Road, what's the manner in which you look to it and process it, and what do you look towards when you see a community board decision that obviously evidences divergence on where to go on a particular application or objections to applications? How is that process once it leaves the community board's hands? I don't know if Richard, if you're able to weigh in on that.
Yeah, obviously, sorry I couldn't make your first 45 minutes of your meeting today. Yes, so it's a harder process because in the older days, the application was filed and it went through a longer period of being visible. Although most community boards didn't have the bandwidth to really lock into the application and take advantage of that extra time. Now, I don't know if city planning is still calling it blueprint, but under this current process, a lot of the application refinement happens before the application is filed. So it's really up to the individual applicant to reach out to community board, elected officials to let them know, they're in the process. Otherwise, there's really not much engagement. So the engagement really is with city planning staff, and they're getting some guidance from city planning staff to some extent, whether their application is a bit over the top or within the realm, although, city planning staff can't speak for the department. So you do get the application in its submitted form as a community board, but the process from submitted application to certified is a lot tighter than it used to be. So one thing to think about is once you do get access to the application, do you start jumping on it and trying to have some dialogue that may or may not influence the developer's willingness to tweak something before they get certified?
And how much, how much can a community board step in and say, okay, so it's on our radar. We don't necessarily need to schedule our meeting yet, but we're aware of the application. How much can a community board get involved at that point to dig in?
You have the right to offer the developer, the applicant, the opportunity to come to the community board to make a presentation. You could do it at a full board meeting. You could do it at a committee meeting. You could do it more like a town hall where the developer, it's really a learning moment, right? It's not really critiquing the application. It's more an opportunity to ask questions, to have a deeper dive. You're still dependent on the expertise of the applicant to teach you about the application. So you could decide to what extent that omits some pieces of information, because often applications are not lot specific. Based on a logical planning basis for justifying a boundary, you will have out parcels. So the developer isn't necessarily speaking to the out parcels, and it really is on you to be thinking of all the properties affected by the rezoning and not simply the applicant's property. And so getting these dialogues, if the applicant's willing to come in, I think it's great. Otherwise, it's limited to the committee jump starting and having people starting to focus. Everybody doesn't have to read everything, but can people read various parts of it? So collectively, then you reconvene and try to share what you learned.
And
to some extent, I'm available. I don't know what beyond December brings. I may or may not have looked at the application myself at this point, but certainly if you ask questions, I'll try to at least provide responses to you.
That's great, and we always welcome you as a resource. And there are other resources out there too. So we obviously can turn to the applicant. What about city planning? You say that they work directly with the applicants and early in the process. They shape the application before they certify it. What about there in terms of their accessibility? I imagine you work with them as well.
Well, I think city planning would also be accessible as well if they're reached out to with the application. And there are times the applicant may come to an elected official, they may come to a borough president, may not think of coming to community board. So you may want to message your council members, right? You'll have some new ones covering part of the district, so that that they would direct the applicant to start a dialogue.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
That applicant taking a chance, right? Planning step of the application, but the so and is the council member not do that this way out. Yes, spending $1,000 do this. Total check.
I know. Okay. Thank. Yeah. Sorry, we lost a little bit towards the end, but we always appreciate the thoughts, Richard. We just have a few more minutes, and I see a few more hands. So let's try to check off a few here. Stephen, do you have another comment?
Yeah, one thing that I remember being surprised about in one of the presentations, and I apologize if I don't have this figure right, but it was something like in our community districts, about like 3% of residential buildings were built 2000 and later, and I was really surprised that how low the figure was. And you know, we're talking. I think it's great that we're being so introspective and revisiting. Not revisiting is probably the wrong word, but thinking about the situation with 1620 Cortellu and how to address it. But the I based on that and based on, you know, just, you know, knowing what's going on around the city in terms of development, you know, it seems like these types of projects, you know, we don't get them as many as much as you know, some other districts I'm sure do, as many as other boards do that are around the city, that have to deal with these types of issues more often. And I guess one thing that, you know, so, you know, because I recognize that, you know, more affordable housing needs to be built around the city, and you know, presumably locally as well, because that's needed for many of our community members. But you know, I guess there's a little bit of tension here where, you know, I feel like in some ways, you know, and this is discussed, you know, in terms of housing needs, that, you know, Community Board 14, you know, maybe we need to pull more weight compared to, you know, what other community districts are dealing with in terms of development, and maybe we're not. I don't know exactly. I don't know if any of the presentations I missed would have shed more light on that. But I guess from the standpoint, and you know, one thought that occurred to me was during the 1620 Cortellu, someone was one of the community members was actually privately chatting me, which was fine, you know, in response to something, and you know, basically complaining that the community board wasn't representing the feelings of the community in an action. And so I'm just wondering if there's tension between recognizing, okay, the city needs more affordable housing, and potentially, you know, Community District 14 is not, you know, has not been providing as much as compared to other districts, but at the same time, you know, we're representing folks in Community Board 14, so those interests supersede. Just a thought, throwing it out there. That's all.
Yeah, no, thanks, Stephen. And I see in the chat, Michael and Sean, you're talking a little bit about the statistics and that it might be a little more rosy in terms of what might be present in the district. But you know, it's obviously still stated that affordable housing is a primary issue. We're coming up against the hour here, so I think I'll leave perhaps last. There are a few more hands, but I think I'll turn it over to Joanne just for any final comments before we wrap up here. No, you're on mute, Joanne.
I find this idea that DCP is weighing in on the application before certification and before, you know, we really see it compelling. And what my question is, and it's a rhetorical question, is how do we form a better relationship with the city planners that are focused perhaps in our district or know our district well, and how can we bring the insight that we are really trying to mine from the community, their wants, their needs, their values, their objectives, in a conversation with these planners, so that when they're looking at the application, they can say to themselves, oh, I remember, you know, in this particular area, people are concerned about X. And so they apply it to the application before we actually see it. But again, rhetorical question, just an idea of how we can form better relationships and also, you know, more communication with DCP. Thanks.
Thank you, and I think that is a major takeaway from today. Sean, should we end there? I know Barton has not spoken yet. Just wanted to see if you wanted to have a quick word. It's up to you.
I'll leave that up to you because I do have to jump off to get to a junction bid meeting. But I did want to, before I do that, just check in with those who participated today. I mean, we talked about continuing this lunch and learn, and we talked about different topics. But I'm feeling like there's still so much meat on this bone. Sorry, vegetarians. There's still a lot. There's still a lot to do here on this particular topic, and I think the pressures are great. How do people feel about continuing the lunch and learns, and whether we do it every single week beginning in September or some other schedule? Should we keep going?
I like the idea.
Sure.
Yep.
I would
All right.
just say be sensitive to staff time about that. Like, again, I always feel bad. Like, we come up with all these cool ideas, but it takes time from everyone else. But these were great.
No, I enjoyed curating them and they've been valuable to me too. So, and then I'll let the rest of you decide if you're going to hang out any longer, but I have to dash. But thanks again, Joanne and Greg and Michael for hosting these and for giving us the leeway to put them together, and for all of and everybody for the great conversation.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, so much for putting this together. I actually have to jump too, so it's either we can close it here or if the folks who want to stay on. Go ahead, Joanne.
I'll stay for about 5 more minutes because I'd like to hear what Barton has to say, and then I'll close out the session. And thank you so much, Greg, and thank you, Sean.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm honored. In my experience, community boards are pretty much considered nuisances to developers, especially the ones who have to come before us, and the ones who are, putting up as of right feel that they can probably get through without even engaging us whatsoever. So anything I feel that we can do to keep our ears to the ground, and if the community feels that we are receptive to their interests and concerns, they will come to us when they start, sniffing something possibly happening. So I feel it's sort of our job to get out there and sort of find things before they pop up. And then developers will know that they can't just push something through and figure that the community board will engage and that it's better for them to have a discussion with us before they actually put a shovel in the ground. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Barton. Yeah, we're fully on board with that and trying to come up with some mechanisms in which we can collect information and have a better community toolbox to apply when these things come forward. It's a little bit after 2 now. Unless anybody has something super burning, I'm going to conclude this session. Glenn, are you okay? Do you have something you wanted to add?
Just a quick process. When anyone submits something to city planning, they're going to come out and do their own evaluation and make their own determinations that may or may not agree with yours. When we did the rezoning here, that was under Bloomberg, and their thing is, if you want to downzone some areas, you have to upzone other areas. It wasn't something we necessarily wanted, but we wanted the downzoning, and then they chose 4X, which was much too big, and we had to fight tooth and nail to get them to agree to 3X. So it isn't, we have a great relationship with Jonah and other people, but they're going to make their own independent evaluations, and that's what they're going to be willing to go with unless we can somehow convince them otherwise. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. I hope that, the subjective data that we can pull from the community in some kind of future forum that we can do in person will hold some weight with the Department of City Planning when they're looking at projects in our district. So at this time, I'll go ahead and start saying thank you to everyone who contributed to this 6-part series. This is the last episode, and we're probably going to bring it back in the fall, perhaps on this topic and maybe other topics. Thank you to Mr. Richard Barrick for being with us every week and helping us along. Thank you to everyone from the community who came out to join us and contribute to the conversation. And thanks to Anya Hoyer and Brian for make this possible, and Sean Campbell, who was the innovator of this series, always thinking ahead and how we can better communicate. So we'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Have a great summer.